What if I told you that one of the biggest predictors of a country's wealth has nothing to do with its people, its government, or its resources? It's something far simpler. Something that was decided millions of years ago by shifting tectonic plates and ancient geological forces. It's whether or not your country touches the ocean. Right now, there are 45 landlocked countries on Earth, nations completely surrounded by other nations with no direct access to the sea. 16 of them are in Africa, 12 in Europe, 5 in South America, and the rest scattered across Asia. And here's the striking thing: they're disproportionately poor. The average landlocked developing country has a GDP per capita roughly 40% lower than its coastal neighbors. That's not a small gap. That's the difference between poverty and relative prosperity. Look at East Africa. Ethiopia, landlocked, has a GDP per capita around $1,000. Right next door, Kenya, with its coastline and port of Mombasa, sits at nearly $2,000. Or South America. Bolivia, locked between its neighbors, struggles at around $3,500 per person. Chile, stretched along the Pacific coast, enjoys over $15,000. Uganda versus Tanzania, Paraguay versus Argentina, Zambia versus Mozambique. Again and again, the same pattern emerges. So we have to ask, is this just coincidence? Are we looking at a statistical fluke where landlocked countries just happen to have other problems? Or is there something fundamental about access to the ocean, about being able to simply put a ship in the water that shapes a nation's economic destiny?
The answer is more dramatic than you might think.
To understand why landlocked countries struggle, you need to understand one brutal economic reality. Moving things costs money. And when you're landlocked, it costs a lot more money. The World Bank has calculated that landlocked countries face trade costs that are 50 to 100% higher than their coastal neighbors. That's not a typo. Double the cost just to get your goods to international markets. Let me give you a concrete example. If you're shipping a standard container from a coastal West African country to Europe, you're looking at around $1,500 to $2,000. Straightforward. Load it on a ship, send it across the Atlantic. But if you're shipping that same container from the Central African Republic, you're paying $3,000 to $5,000, maybe more. Why? Because that container has to travel overland first, through roads that might be unpaved, across borders where it gets inspected, taxed, and delayed, through countries that might have their own political instability or bureaucratic red tape. Take Rwanda, a landlocked country trying to compete in the global coffee market. Rwanda grows excellent coffee, high altitude, volcanic soil, perfect conditions. But to get that coffee to buyers in Europe or America, it has to travel nearly 1,500 kilometers overland to reach the port of Mombasa in Kenya. That's 1,500 kilometers of fuel costs, vehicle maintenance, border crossings, and time. Time where your product isn't earning money, it's just traveling. And here's the thing to keep in mind. Your success heavily relies on your neighbor's infrastructure. If Kenya faces issues such as poor roads, political tension at the border, or increased port fees in Mombasa, these challenges also become obstacles for Rwanda. You have all the costs of international trade, but almost none of the control. But the disadvantages don't stop at trade costs. Think about natural resources. Coastal countries can develop fishing industries. The global seafood market is worth over $150 billion annually. They can explore offshore oil and gas deposits. Landlocked countries, they get none of that. Tourism is another massive gap. Beach tourism is one of the world's largest industries. The Maldives, Seychelles, Caribbean islands, entire economies built on coastline. Landlocked countries can offer mountains, wildlife, culture, and some do successfully, but they're competing without one of tourism's biggest draws. Then there's foreign investment. Companies looking to build factories or distribution centers naturally gravitate toward ports. Why set up manufacturing in a landlocked country when you can build near a coast and cut your logistics costs in half? The data bears this out. Landlocked countries receive 20 to 30% less foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP compared to coastal nations, according to UNCTAD. It's a compounding problem. Less investment means less development. Less development means worse infrastructure. Worse infrastructure means even higher trade costs.
Step back and look at the global picture, and it's stark. 32% of landlocked countries are classified as least developed countries by the United Nations. For coastal countries, that number is just 15%. Landlocked developing countries have an average export to GDP ratio of around 30%. Coastal developing countries, 45%. They're exporting half again as much of what they produce. The evidence is overwhelming. Being landlocked is an economic handicap. But here's where it gets interesting, because it's not an absolute rule. Switzerland. Landlocked, completely surrounded by other countries, no access to the sea. GDP per capita, over $92,000, one of the wealthiest nations on Earth. Luxembourg, also landlocked, clocks in at an eye-watering $135,000 per person, the highest in the world. Austria, Czech Republic, Slovakia, all landlocked, all prosperous, all thriving members of the global economy. So what's going on here? How do these countries escape what seems like a geographic curse? The answer comes down to three things: location, integration, and what you build. First, location. These countries aren't just landlocked, they're landlocked in Europe. They're surrounded by wealthy, stable neighbors with excellent infrastructure. Switzerland can move goods to Rotterdam, Hamburg, or Genoa with relative ease. Second, integration. They're all part of the European Union or closely integrated with it. That means no customs delays at borders, no tariffs, no political barriers. Goods flow across borders almost as freely as they would within a single country. The friction of being landlocked is dramatically reduced. But third, and this is crucial, they've built high-value economies that don't depend on moving heavy, low-margin goods. Switzerland makes watches, pharmaceuticals, and provides financial services. Luxembourg is a banking hub. These are products and services where shipping costs are almost irrelevant. But what about outside of Europe? Can a landlocked, developing country actually succeed? Meet Botswana. When Botswana gained independence in 1966, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. Landlocked, surrounded by apartheid South Africa, Rhodesia, and other struggling neighbors, with a GDP per capita of around $70. Today, it's around $7,000 to $8,000, which is considered upper middle income. Not wealthy by European standards, but a remarkable success story for sub-Saharan Africa. Yes, Botswana discovered diamonds. That helped immensely. But plenty of resource-rich African countries have squandered their wealth through corruption and mismanagement. Botswana did something different. It invested diamond revenues in education, healthcare, and infrastructure. It maintained stable, democratic governance. It built strong institutions and rule of law. It became one of the least corrupt countries in Africa. Does being landlocked still hurt Botswana? Absolutely. Its trade costs are higher than they should be. It depends on South African ports and infrastructure. It faces all the challenges we've discussed. But Botswana proves something important. Geography is not destiny. So what separates the success stories from the struggling landlocked nations? It comes down to a few key factors. Regional cooperation, having neighbors you can work with, not just depend on. Strong institutions and good governance, because you can't afford to waste resources when geography is already working against you. Economic diversification, moving beyond raw materials to higher value products and services. And strategic infrastructure investment, building the roads, rails, and systems that connect you to the world. The landlocked disadvantage is real, but it can be overcome. The question is, how many landlocked countries have the resources, the neighbors, and the governance to pull it off? The international community hasn't ignored this problem. In 2014, the United Nations launched something called the Vienna Program of Action for Landlocked Developing Countries, a 10-year plan specifically designed to address the unique challenges these nations face. The focus? Transit corridors, regional integration, and infrastructure. Because here's the thing. If you're landlocked, your success is inherently tied to your neighbor's success. You need them to have good roads, efficient ports, and open borders, which means cooperation isn't optional. It's essential.
Africa is leading some of the most ambitious efforts. The African Continental Free Trade Area, launched in 2019, aims to create a single market across the continent. If successful, it would dramatically reduce the border friction that makes being landlocked so expensive. Then there are the massive infrastructure projects. East Africa's northern corridor is upgrading roads and railways from the port of Mombasa deep into Uganda, Rwanda, and beyond. These aren't small undertakings. They're billion-dollar investments in reshaping the economic geography of entire regions. And here's an interesting question. Could technology change the game? In an increasingly digital economy, where services can be exported over fiber optic cables instead of container ships, does being landlocked matter less? It's a compelling idea, but the reality is that even digital economies need physical infrastructure. Data centers, reliable electricity, and yes, connections to undersea internet cables, which still favor coastal nations. But there are genuine success stories emerging, countries that are actively working to overcome their geographic disadvantage. Ethiopia, despite its political challenges, has invested heavily in a new electric railway connecting Addis Ababa directly to the port of Djibouti. When it's fully operational, it could cut transit times from days to hours. Mongolia, sitting between Russia and China with vast mineral wealth, has negotiated transit agreements that guarantee access to Chinese ports for its copper and coal exports. It's not perfect, but it's transformed Mongolia's mining sector. Paraguay has leveraged something many landlocked countries lack: rivers. The Paraguay and Parana rivers give it water access all the way to the Atlantic, and the country has built its agricultural export economy around this natural advantage. These aren't magic solutions. Ethiopia's railway has faced technical problems and debt concerns. Mongolia still pays premium prices for logistics. Paraguay is still poorer than its coastal neighbors. But they represent something important: landlocked countries actively taking control of their destiny, rather than accepting geographic fate. But, and this is crucial, geography is not destiny. Switzerland, Luxembourg, Austria, and Botswana, they prove that landlocked countries can thrive. It requires the right combination of factors: regional cooperation, strong governance, smart economic policy, and often a bit of luck in terms of neighbors and resources. The challenge is that most landlocked countries don't have these advantages. Many are not just landlocked, they're surrounded by other poor countries. It's been called the double curse of geography. Zimbabwe is landlocked and surrounded by struggling economies. Chad is landlocked and surrounded by conflict zones. Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Niger. Landlocked countries in landlocked regions. For them, overcoming geography means not just fixing their own problems, but hoping their neighbors fix theirs too. So look at a map of the world's landlocked countries. 45 nations. Over 500 million people. Many of them facing an uphill economic battle that began long before they were born. Some will overcome it. Some are already on that path. But for most, the simple accident of where rivers flow and mountains rise will continue to shape their futures in profound ways. Geography isn't destiny, but it does stack the deck. Thanks for watching.